Hello and welcome to another episode. The question we're asking today is the Suzuki Jimny any good off-road? Well, as you might have guessed, based on where it's parked, the answer is likely to be a yes. So we can quickly get to that summary of, yeah, it is pretty good off-road, but it does come with a little bit of a caveat to that. So this video is going to explore the question of how is it good off-road, where and why, and also what are the pitfalls. Now, if you don't want to hear about the talking and a little bit about the vehicle, feel free to skip ahead. It's not extreme off-road here, but as you can see, we've got a little bit of a section. We've got some humps and lumps and slopes and some cross-axlers. So we're going to take it around here and just demonstrate some of the capability in some of the areas that maybe it's not so good on. So to start, what have we got? Well, this is my 2020 JB74 UK spec Jimny, SZ5 spec, so comes with all the goodies in terms of, like, you know, climate control, infotainment system, everything else. Nice spec. And as you can see, it's not 100% standard, and there's reasons why. So in standard trim, the little Suzuki is a live axle, body on frame 4x4. Now, if you compare that to something like a Discovery Sport, Dacia Duster, any kind of sort of monocoque, unibody, fully independent suspension vehicle, you know, these are pretty good. They have got a lot of suspension travel by comparison. They're small and nimble. They've got quite a good full drive system, and you're going to be able to get quite a lot of places. They've also got pretty good approach and departure angles, and even on paper, the standard breakover angle isn't so bad. So breakover is this bit here between the wheelbase, so whether you're going to be able to hit the bottom on anything or not. So some real out of the box bonuses are live axles, moderately good suspension travel, and the fact that the Jimny is really small and compact. So we've got just over an 88-inch wheelbase, which, believe it or not, is ever so slightly longer than a Series 3 Land Rover 88, but we are quite a bit narrower. The Jimny is quite a narrow track vehicle overall, and the body's narrow. Off-road, that's really good because it allows you to pick different lines. It gives you more room on the terrain, especially if you're doing something like laning or out on trails or something. A large vehicle, you'll be very much dictated where you can go. A narrower vehicle, you can pick your line a little bit more. It's a nice boxy shape. You can see all the corners really well. Visibility out the front is fantastic. You don't need a front view camera to be able to drive this off-road like you do with a lot of modern American pickup trucks. All these things are really great for it. The things that do let it down, and there's a few, is while we say it's got good suspension travel, actually in stock form, it's not as good as an old Land Rover Defender. You know, they have a lot more suspension travel and a lot more flex out of the box. And while we say the breakover angle is pretty good on this and the approach angle, the Jimny comes on pretty small tyres. So from the factory, they're on a 195/80/15. They're just over 27-inch tall. It's tiny. So I found that actually it would sit on the gearbox, on the transfer box, quite a lot. And you also got, just see it here sticking down, where the radius arm mounts onto the chassis. You've got them at the front of the vehicle and at the back there for each axle. They used to sort of dig in and plough quite a lot. And the front bumper would also impact the ground. So the standard front bumper comes all the way down here, and the factory recovery point is this thing here. And as you can see, it's looking pretty rusty because it's been acting as a plough many times off-road. So they actually aren't quite as capable and rugged as you think, and in reality they will lift wheels quite a lot, and they do rely very heavily on their traction control system. So on the last version to the Gen 3 Jimny, Suzuki did bring out traction control. I think they call it All Grip or something. I'm sure there's a badge on the back for it somewhere actually. Or is it just on the marketing one? Oh yeah, all grip. And all that really is just an off-road bias traction control. So you may have heard it called brake distribution traction control, something like that. It's not stability control. It's not about killing the throttle, but what it will do is when one wheel spins on an axle line, it'll apply the ABS to that wheel, which then transfers power to the opposite wheel. So in essence, they kind of simulate a little bit of an automatic torque biasing diff. Not quite a full locking diff, but they will make all four wheels spin. Which again, sounds really, really good, and it is good. The only thing is, you do need quite a few revs to make it work. It doesn't kick in at really, really low wheel speeds. So if you've ever watched something like a Discovery 3 or 4 off-road, the resolution on their traction control is fantastic. They hardly need any wheel slip to make the traction control work. The traction control on here is much more like a TD5 Defender Land Rover or a Freelander 1 or Discovery 2, where you do need to put a few revs on it. You need to get that wheel that's in the air spinning before it will start really kicking in the traction control to make the other wheel spin. So that causes some other problems, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But the traction control overall enhances the capability of the vehicle tenfold. Without the traction control, it would actually get stopped really easy, and I imagine early Gen 3s, completely vanilla, out of the box setup, while they're a lot of fun, it probably is really easy to stop them, and they'll get stopped in places that something like a Land Rover Defender would just drive straight through and not even realise it's a problem. But the traction control kind of levels the playing field and gives you some extra capability over just pure open diffs. The other issue is ground clearance. So we kind of talked about that with the breakover angle and the approach angle, and some of that's just about how high the body sits. So out of the box, they've got okay ground clearance. I think again on paper they measure favourably to other vehicles, but as I said, the wheels are quite tiny out of the factory. You know, if you go back to like the mid-late 70s, if you bought a Land Rover Series 3, it might have come on small wheels, but actually most people could option to have a 750/16, and that's what, nearly 32-inch tall tyre versus 27-inch on the Jimny for the same wheelbase. So you can kind of work out that, you know, you can calculate your angle here is going to be a lot less on the Jimny than what it would have been on a 1970s Land Rover. So what have we done to address some of these things? Well, first off, we've got a 2-inch lift kit on here, and it's not just a lift kit, it's a lift kit that also gives you additional suspension travel. So we've raised the vehicle up by 2 inches, and that's a real 2 inches, you know, or sort of 50mm if you want metric version. So there are quite a few kits out there that don't really do 2 inches. I think Old Man Emu do one that's only 40mm, and some of the others might claim certain heights but don't always, you know, deliver on it. So we've gone up 2 inches. We're also running a bigger tyre, so I'm on a 235/75/15, so it's a little bit fatter, and this comes in at just under 29-inch tall. So it's about 1.5 inches taller than standard tyres it works out at. So you can work out through that we've actually gained sort of 2 3/4 inches overall in terms of ground clearance, and that makes a big difference. So it very rarely now sits on the transfer case, and even so you can actually just see them there where the trailing arm and the radius arm attached to the chassis. It doesn't sit on those anywhere near as much and not to the same problem. Now I have actually added some little protecting skid plates to those parts of the radius arms, and I've also got a full skid plate underneath the transfer case as well, just to protect it, because they really are quite vulnerable. We've also got heavy duty winch bumper on the front, which gives much better approach angle, and I've also got some sidebar rock rails as well. They aren't essential, but they do protect the side of the vehicle. So if you're going over rocks or boulders, they would be hitting that sill panel, and if you need to, you know, drive really close to a tree, at least you know you're going to hit the sidebar before you're going to actually impact the tree. So it will protect the vehicle quite a lot, and as you can see, the bar actually steps out quite a lot. So that's another thing that's really good about the design of the Jimny, while we're talking about good things, is if you look at the bodywork in comparison to where the wheel arch is, the bodywork actually sits in, So if you're off-road on a very narrow lane, you know, you shouldn't be leaning the bodywork up against the bank quite so easily, because the wheels stick out and the wheels will hit first, and then you've got the wheel arches as well. And as the wheel arches are plastic and replaceable, it means you're much less likely to damage the bodywork. Whereas if you look at something like a Discovery Sport, for instance, which is a vehicle that costs about twice what this does, you've got no sort of protection there, that if you were to take it off-road and you were to get it on a real kilter on a tight bank, you're going to rub down the whole side of the vehicle before you get to the end of it. So much more likely to be expensive to replace. And again, we've got things like the rear lights in the bumper here, so if you broke a rear light, it's much easier to replace it. Or if you broke the bumper, you know, you're not talking about a whole great big piece of body panel. So there are some really, really good aspects about the Jimny just in its core design. So we've talked lack of ground clearance, so that's quite easily solved. There's lots of different suspension kits you can get out there, and you can see we're quite flexed out now here. You can see the shocks fully extended, got quite a nice big gap in the wheel arch. Stuffs the front up okay. Now we've still got anti-roll bars on at the front, so we could take the anti-roll bar off, and there's even some detachable anti-roll bars, although they are horrendous money. But ultimately, the suspension isn't too bad. But even with this 2-inch lift kit, that's not only giving us 2 inches of lift, but it's also giving us about 2 inches more suspension travel as well. It still doesn't flex as well as a standard 1980s Land Rover 90, which is quite amazing really. And if you want another vehicle to compare to, you'd probably say Jeep Wrangler. So the Wrangler TJ, they always rode quite low from the factory, but you know, I think they had reasonable travel, and quite easy to put a lift kit on those as well. But compared to something like a JK or a modern JL Jeep Wrangler, the Jimny doesn't have the same level of flex. And to get anything close to that, you're going to have to do some really serious mods. Probably go up to a 4-inch lift, change the front and rear control arms, different prop shafts. You're going to have to ride much higher because you can't fit a longer shock in. One of the limitations of the Jimny is the top shock mount is all enclosed. So if you go for a longer shock, well, the wheel won't be able to come up as far because the shock's not going to be able to compress enough. On a Land Rover, it's really easy. You can put longer shocks as long as you can get different upper mounts. On here, the only thing you can do is go down with a longer shock and then basically put a big bump stop in, an extended bump stop to stop the wheel going up so far. And that does make it a bit more of an extreme modification. And also it adds cost. You know, if you're buying all that stuff, you're probably talking about, you know, spending £2,500 on a suspension kit on a vehicle that only costs £19,500 brand new. And very quickly, you're going to be up at the prices of, actually, you should have just bought a stock Jeep Wrangler, because you're only going to be getting to that level of capability, but you're still spending the money to do it. But the biggest limitation off-road is probably gearing. So we do have a proper transfer case in the Jimny. It does have low range, but it's not a super low cruise speed. So low first is, in my opinion, for terrain like this, way too quick. Especially when you've got a relatively revvy petrol engine that doesn't have a huge amount of torque off idle. So to get the traction control to work, I said before, you need to put some revs on it and some wheel speed. You have to attack things a lot quicker than I would necessarily like to do sometimes. Now in the wet it's not too bad because the wheels will generally spin quite willingly in the wet, but in the dry like we are today, what you'll find is that you'll get some huge wheel lifts trying to get the traction control to work sometimes. And also if you are trying to drive it in a slow controlled manner, it is incredibly easy to stall the vehicle. It really doesn't take a lot of effort, you know, just off tick over where you think you're going to be okay, or even on tick over, and you'll just hit a little bit of a lump. It'll want to try and do something and it will just kill the engine. In an old diesel Land Rover, so I run about in a 1989 2.5 litre turbo diesel Land Rover, it's only rated at 89 horsepower. The Jimny's meant to have 102 horsepower, so a huge difference in terms of power. The diesel's just got loads of grunt down low, even off the turbo. Diesel engines are nice and torquey and robust. So almost this entire site here, the Land Rover will actually do at idle in low first, and you'll be able to go across at least 90% of the stuff here until you get cross-axled. The Jimny probably only do about 30% of the terrain here on tick over, if that, maybe less. So despite the gearing deficit, with the way the engine is as well, you then have to have more revs on, so you're going higher revs and worse gearing, so you are travelling quicker. And of course with that you get less engine braking as well. We do have hill descent control, but again that's still perhaps not as slow as I'd really like. So if you're going down something really steep, you know, if you imagine that, but steeper and maybe 3 times the height, it's just a little bit too quick for what I would really like to do. Now you can change your gearing, that's not a problem, but it's not cheap. It's like 1100 quid for the transfer case gear set. Then you've got to find somebody to fit it. Could do it at home, but it's, you know, slightly more advanced than what a lot of home mechanics will want to try. And then you've got the downside is that it also impacts your road gearing. So even though you lower the gearing off-road, you're going to lower it on road as well, which means that this is probably the smallest tyre you'd want to run, and you're still going to have a more buzzy engine on road than what you would have done with a stock vehicle. So you have to go up a tyre size really. But then when you go up a tyre size, yeah, you get the benefits of more clearance, but you've only got a 1.5 litre naturally aspirated engine to cope with the bigger tyres. And all the other things that come with running bigger tyres, so you might find you get more rubbing. So at the moment I have no rubbing at all anywhere, but if I was to go up to a 3950 or a 311050, you know, there's going to be knock-on mods I'm going to have to do to be able to run a tyre of that size, and you probably would want to put it at least onto sort of 3 or a 4-inch lift to run that sort of tyre. So again, it's a downside of, is it good off-road? Yes, but there is that caveat that actually to make it really good off-road, you might have to do quite a lot of mods, which then require you to think about other mods, or at least compromises in terms of usage. Now, off-roading is a really broad tar, or a really broad brush, shall we say, and not every vehicle is going to be good at every type of off-roading. In fact, very few vehicles are good at every type of off-roading, because it depends if you're doing overlanding, if you're doing rock crawling, if you're just doing sort of general green laning, if you're doing road tax vehicle trials, if you're just having a look with a play about on some off-road terrain like this. The Jimny's a small vehicle, so you're going to have all the small vehicle sort of downsides of that. So it's small on the outside, it's going to be small on the inside as well. You know, we don't have 5 seats in there and a big boot. You know, we have 2 usable seats and a reasonable boot, or you have 4 seats and a small boot, depending on whether you want to put the rear seats up or not. But one thing I do find that is a bit old-fashioned is, on the road you run this in 2-wheel drive, so it just drives the rear wheels. Now I come from a Land Rover background, so since the introduction of the Range Rover, what, in 1971ish, they've had permanent 4-wheel drive, that you haven't really got to worry about that. You've got, you know, on the road it's just 4-wheel drive. And if you had a Defender any time through from the 80s right up until sort of 2016, when they stopped making the traditional Defender, you have a centre differential, and that makes a huge difference when you're just driving in and out of wet fields, if you're driving on sand or snow, because you don't always need to put the centre diff in, it just works. You know, if it's slippery on the road, whatever. One thing I find, especially this time of year, is out on the stubble fields. This does not like running in 2-wheel drive on the stubble, because the computer goes mental and it just kicks in the stability control and it kills the throttle and stops you being able to drive properly. Really annoying. Old Defender, you don't have to do anything. You just drive in the field, drive and come back out again. In this you've got to stop, put it in 4 high, and then at least you can carry on a bit. But even in 4 high, it doesn't really allow you to disable the stability control properly. So if you do get wheel spin, it will reactivate stability control, which will then start killing the throttle. All I can think is that Suzuki never tested the vehicle, or they were just being moronic when they decided to not allow you to turn it off. I really don't know. Fortunately, we don't get many sand dunes here in the UK, but I can certainly see that if you live somewhere with big sand dunes and you need high range and you need wheel spin and high speed, I imagine the Jimny is not very good. I believe there is a hack where you can put like a paper clip or a bit of wire jammed into a socket, into a little plug socket up behind the throttle pedal somewhere, and you can get it to disable the traction control completely, but then you have none of it. You've got no stability control, you've got no traction control, and you can't turn it back on until you turn the engine off and sort of reverse your mod. So real compromise there. And another thing for the UK and European market is we have tyre pressure sensor monitors, which in principle sounds like a great idea, but you cannot drop the pressure below 26 psi without it lighting the dash up like a Christmas tree and making the dash completely useless to show you any other information. So if you're off-road, if you are driving on some rocks and you want to lower the tyre pressures down for a genuine reason, the Suzuki will not let you do it without throwing a complete temper tantrum. Why they couldn't have implemented something where you could actually reset the value for the tyre pressures, I do not know. It'd make much more sense to allow that to be user configurable, but it isn't. And another thing, you've got lots and lots of bongs, so if you don't plug your seatbelt in, as soon as you go quicker than 5 miles an hour, it will start bonging at you incessantly. And it's like, okay, on the road, I can understand that. It's a safety feature. Some people are idiots, unfortunately you have to have these things. But this is an off-road vehicle. Why, when you're in low range, does it not disable that? Or at least give you a switch to turn it off? Because when you're off-road, you may not wear a seatbelt all the time. Especially if you're on private land, if you're going through lots of gates and you're in and out of the vehicle, if you're using it as a working vehicle, if you've got it on a farm, you're doing stuff, you know, herding sheep, you know, having something that keeps bonging at you every single time you get in the vehicle and try and move it is hugely irritating. Again, all I can assume is that Suzuki either A, don't care, didn't test it, or a combination of both. And it kind of makes you not want to invest in their products in the future when they can't be bothered to actually do some of the simple legwork. Anyhow, we're digressing a little bit. What we're going to do now is jump in the vehicle and let's take it around some of these bits of terrain, and you'll be able to see how well it does or doesn't do in some areas. And then you can formulate your own opinion on whether you think it's a good off-road vehicle. Right, so we're in the Jimny, we're in low first, we've got hill descent on, running at just over tick over here. I'm going to go around the back of this first mound. You can hear the traction control kicking in there, not quite in view of the cameras yet, but we're going to go through a little dip that's a bit of a cross axler. So I'm going about as slow as the vehicle will comfortably go. Now we're entering this cross axler here. You can feel the traction control worked, and again, almost logged. Go hard right round. It's probably going to pick up a rear wheel here. Okay, we're out of view of the cameras. What we'll do is we'll come back round again. What we'll do is, rather than going straight up, we're going to carry on all the way round. You can see it's just on the verge of wanting to stall. That's on tick over. It has made it through, but it did make the gear stick wobble quite a bit. But ultimately, the vehicle is quite capable. We do have enough suspension travel, we do have enough low speed control, and the traction control works really well. Right, so we're going the opposite way around this time. Again, we'll let the little bit of engine braking and stability control, hill descent control, bit of a wheel lift there. time we're going to do this bit in reverse. So we're going to go down this steep bit into that cross axler. Again, that feels quite quick. Hill descent control doesn't kick in until quite late. So the vehicle does it, but it kind of feels a little bit out of control. And that's where that lower gearing would really be lovely. Just to have the vehicle under a little bit more control. But this time we have a bit of a side slope as we come around here. Still not quite in view of the cameras yet, but you should be able to see the vehicle coming around. And it makes it look quite easy, really. Right, so this time let's see if we can get it just to get it cross axled again and kick the traction control in. So this was the bit I came through earlier. I've got the cameras here now. So again, we're just over tick over. And of course, I must be on a different line because it's just driven straight through. Let's try that one again. Found a little bit of a cross axle just there, and here we are. So you can see the traction control does do a good job, but we are maximising all of our suspension travel on something that actually doesn't look that extreme or severe. Although to be fair, I do know that you can stop a standard Land Rover 90 coming through some of these bits. It's something we've done many times. So this is really where the game changer is in the traction control, and what really elevates the Jimny from being an okay off-roader to a really good one out of the box. And I appreciate if you're rock crawling, you don't really want lots of wheel spin, you're probably going to want to invest in some proper aftermarket lockers. But for terrain like this, and I say if this was wet, it would go even better. The traction control just kicks in enough and it just drives through with relative ease. You do have to learn how to use the traction control. The trick is not to back off the throttle. If you back off, that's it, it doesn't work at all, you kind of kill it. And you don't need to go full bore, wide open throttle either. It's just about keeping that smooth, constant throttle. I like to describe it as kind of rolling onto the throttle pedal. You know, so you keep it steady and then you just roll on a little bit just to be able to keep those revs sort of stable and make sure the system works. So I've got another thing to try here which will demonstrate another trait, and that's stability as well as suspension travel. Is being narrow, it allows you to pick your line, but what you should be able to see is coming through here. I'm going to have to foot brake it because it goes way too quick. The front wheel is going to go in a hole in a minute and that's going to pick the wheel up. And that now feels really very chippy. That is not a nice sensation. But it does do it. Now a wider vehicle would feel more stable there, and a vehicle with more suspension travel. So we have a 90 that's got some modified suspension. That will drive through there without lifting a single wheel. And I'm not saying that it's necessarily got more traction because all the wheels are on the ground, although in theory that should be the case, but it does have dislocating suspension. But what it does do is it feels rock stable. It feels really, really secure, as though it's not even breaking a sweat to go through there. Now I've driven this through lots of times, so I knew it would be okay, but if you were out on a trail and you encountered that kind of tippiness and angle and balancing on two wheels, it is quite an unpleasant sensation. Okay, so here we've kind of got the steepest slope on this little section here. It's not super steep, but it's probably steeper than what the camera suggests it is. Now, I know that some of the Land Rovers will pretty much go up here and tick over, especially the newer ones, like the Puma ones that got the anti-stall capability. Again, I'm not quite sure why Suzuki didn't implement any sort of anti-stall into the Jimny. It doesn't seem to have anything, and that would really help it off-road. So what we will do is try and go up as slow as we can. It's dry, it won't have a problem. When it's wet, this can be really slippery because it's like a chalky clay. But what it will do is it will demonstrate the fact we've got a really good approach angle because it won't ground out. And again, since we've had the lift and these tyres, it also doesn't bottom out as we crest the top. And then we'll see what it does on the way back down again. So we are literally just over idle, that 1000 RPM-ish, 1200 RPM. Up it goes. Really easy, lots of control. Now I've still got hill descent control on, so due to the gearing I always put hill descent control on whenever I'm in low range. What we're going to do is we're going to crawl right up to the top of this and just drop over the edge with no throttle on, and we'll see what it does. Almost stalled, down, and just kick into about there, so we're over halfway down before the hill descent control actually kicks in, and then it does slow up. So on a bigger descent it's probably not quite so bad. It will kick in and it will work. The downside is, of course, you've got to be on a bigger descent, so anything that sort of size, which is sort of what, 2 car height, it's just not going to do a very good job. So here we can test a little bit of the hill descent control, a little bit of approach, departure and brake over angle. No rubbing, not too bad, it's not too steep, so engine braking and hill descent work well enough. Now before these tyres and before the lift kit, going over this bit we're just about to go over, this would always sit on the transfer case and was the primary reason for fitting the skid plate. But as you can see, absolutely no trouble now. Again, a little bit quick coming down. Seems to be that hill descent control wants about half a car length to a whole car length to actually figure out what to do and activate. I would like it just to be a little bit snappier, and that's where really if you've got appropriate gearing and appropriate engine braking, you just don't need to rely on the electronics to do that for you. Alright, let's see if we can really make the traction control work this time, and we might even get a bit of a wheel lift as well going up here. So it's quite loose and quite soft. That was a big wheel lift, and part of that's down to running out of suspension travel, and when it forces that other wheel to really work, it kind of picks up the vehicle on one corner. Now without traction control we would be stuck. I don't believe a Gen 3 without traction control and without sufficient mods would get through that without hitting it really hard. Obviously momentum helps a lot, but it can only do so much, and sometimes you only want to go so quick. So this time let's go through that slow and we can actually see what's happening a little bit. So you can see we've got quite an off angle here. So the front wheel's going in, then the rear, and we're going to hit just there, and it's stalled. So that's the thing about the gearing. So if you want to go slow, it's knackered. Alright. So we've got no option, but we're going to have to use a bit of momentum, despite the fact that we do have pretty good traction control. The trouble is, when you use momentum, it does get a little bit violent as well. So this really is the pinnacle of, is the Jimny good off-road? And it's like, well, hell yes, it made it over that obstacle. However, it wasn't really the most refined way of doing it. hence the caveat.